Jerusalem. The year was 451, give or take. No one recorded the exact date. No one thought to. Thousands of pilgrims had come to the city that week. They came from Egypt, from Syria, from the towns along the Mediterranean coast, because the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross was one of the most sacred moments in the Christian calendar, and Jerusalem was the place you were supposed to be when it arrived. The streets were loud with bodies and prayer, and the particular kind of noise that only happens when a very large number of people believe they are standing close to something holy. Among them was a woman from Alexandria. She moved with the crowd toward the church of the Holy Sepulchre. The doors were open. People were flowing through them the way water flows through an open gate. She reached the entrance and tried to step inside. She could not. She tried again. The crowd moved around her, past her, through the door she was standing in front of. No one blocked her. No guard raised a hand. The door was open. She still could not cross it. She stood there long enough that people began to move around her, the way people move around something that has stopped working. She tried a third time, a fourth. Her hands were on the doorframe. Her feet would not move. Something was holding her at that threshold. It was not outside her body. It was inside it. She stepped back from the door. She found a corner of the vestibule, away from the crowd, and she stood there alone with the question that had just become impossible to ignore. What kind of life brings a person to a door they cannot cross? To answer that, you have to go back to a city on the other side of the Mediterranean, back to a girl of 12 who walked away from everything she knew and never looked back to Alexandria. There is a specific kind of freedom that a city offers to people who have no one watching them. Not the freedom of safety, not the freedom of belonging, the freedom of invisibility, the freedom of being able to walk into a crowd and become no one in particular, which is both the best and the worst thing a city can give to a person who is 12 years old and completely alone. Alexandria, in the 5th century, was one of the largest cities in the Roman world. It sat on the northern edge of Egypt, between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, and it had been built from the beginning with a specific intention to be a place where everything met. Alexander the Great had designed it that way in 331 before Christ, and 5 centuries later it was still doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Goods came through its harbor from every direction. Ideas came with them. So did people, languages, religion, and the particular kind of restlessness that accumulates in places where no one is quite from there, and no one is quite sure what the rules are. The city had Greek philosophy in its bones. It had Jewish scholarship in its libraries. It had Egyptian religion in its streets, older than anyone could fully remember. It had Christian communities that had been growing for 3 centuries, and pagan traditions that had been growing for longer than that, and markets where you could buy almost anything if you knew where to look and were willing to not ask too many questions about where it came from. It was a city that did not ask questions. Into that city, sometime around the year 430, a girl named Mary arrived from somewhere in Egypt and began the process of becoming no one in particular. The tradition that preserved her story does not tell us much about where she came from before Alexandria. It does not tell us about her parents, or what her home looked like, or what happened that made a 12-year-old girl decide to leave. The Life of Mary of Egypt, written by Sophronius of Jerusalem in the 7th century. simply says that she left her parents and went to Alexandria. One sentence. No explanation. That absence of explanation is worth pausing on, because the tradition did not feel the need to explain why a child might leave, as if the fact of Alexandria was explanation enough, as if anyone who knew what that city was would understand immediately that it was the kind of place a certain kind of person ends up when they are running towards something they cannot name and away from something they will not name. Mary was 12 years old. She was in one of the most complex cities in the world. She had no money, no connections, and no plan. What she had was the one thing the city rewarded above almost everything else. She was not afraid of it. The Alexandria that Mary entered was a city in a particular kind of tension. Christianity had been the official religion of the Roman Empire for several decades by then. But official and actual are two different things, especially in a city that had been mixing beliefs for 500 years. The theological arguments that had divided the church, the fights over the nature of Christ that had nearly torn the Eastern Empire apart in the previous century, were still raw in Alexandria in ways they were not quite raw anywhere else. The city had seen riots over theology. It had seen a philosopher named Hypatia murdered in its streets by a Christian mob 30 years before Mary arrived. It was a city where ideas had consequences, where the wrong belief in the wrong neighborhood could be genuinely dangerous, where nothing was as settled as the official documents said it was. None of that touched Mary directly. She was not there for the theology. She was there because the city was alive in a way that made everything else feel like it was standing still, and because being 12 and alone in a living city is terrifying in a way that is also, for certain kinds of people, completely intoxicating. She found work. She found shelter. She found the particular social world that exists in every large city for people who have nothing and are willing to trade on whatever they have. The tradition says she lived this way for 17 years. That she was, in the language the hagiography uses, a woman who gave herself to passion without restraint. Here is what the tradition does not say, and what matters enormously for understanding who Mary actually was. It does not say she was a victim. The life of Mary of Egypt is careful about this, in a way that later retellings often are not. It says she did not take money. It says she acted the way she acted, not out of poverty or coercion, but out of something the text calls an insatiable desire, which is a description of agency, not of victimhood. Mary was a woman who made choices, and who kept making them, and who was very good at not looking too closely at what those choices were accumulating into. That distinction matters because it is the thing that makes her story genuinely difficult, and genuinely interesting, and genuinely different from the comfortable version where a powerless woman is rescued from circumstances beyond her control. Mary was not powerless. She was lost. And those are not the same thing. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world at high velocity and mistakes the velocity for direction, who fills every available hour with sensation and company and the particular noise that makes it impossible to hear the quieter thing underneath, who is, in some fundamental sense, hungry, but who has been feeding the hunger with things that do not actually address it, and who has been doing this for long enough that the hunger and the feeding have become the same motion, automatic and unstoppable. Mary in Alexandria was that person. She was also, and this matters, genuinely alive in a way that the people around her could feel. The tradition remembers her as someone who drew people toward her, not just physically, but in the way that certain people draw others. The ones who seem to be operating at a frequency slightly higher than everyone else, who make a room feel more present just by being in it. Alexandria was full of people who were performing aliveness. Mary was the real thing, which made what was happening underneath harder to see, even for her, especially for her. 17 years is a long time to live at a pace that does not allow for stillness. 17 years is long enough for the choices you made at 12 to become the shape of your life. So familiar that you stop seeing them as choices and start seeing them as simply what you are. Mary at 12 had walked into Alexandria with nothing and had built something out of that nothing. And the something she had built was, by any external measure, exactly what it looked like. A life organized around appetite, around the next thing, around the city's endless supply of distraction and noise, and the particular warmth of being wanted by people who did not know you well enough to want anything more complicated than your presence. She was good at it. She had been doing it for long enough to be very good at it. And she was, somewhere underneath all of it, desperately tired in a way she did not have language for, because you cannot run at that pace for 17 years without something accumulating. You cannot organize an entire life around never being still without the stillness starting to press back from underneath. Quiet and insistent and impossible to name. She did not know that yet. Or she knew it the way you know something you have decided not to look at directly, which is a kind of knowing that does not help you very much. What changed was not anything dramatic. It was a ship in the harbor and a group of people preparing to sail to Jerusalem, and Mary standing on the dock, looking at them with the particular feeling of a person who has run out of ways to not think about what they are not thinking about. The feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross was coming. The pilgrims were going to Jerusalem to observe it. They were loud and purposeful in the way that people with a clear destination are loud and purposeful. And Mary, watching them, felt something she would later describe as an almost physical pull. She did not want to go to Jerusalem for religious reasons. She would say this herself later, with a directness that the tradition preserved because it was too honest to invent. She wanted to go because there were people going, and she had spent 17 years going where the people were. And this was another crowd heading somewhere new. The tradition adds something to her motivation that is harder to translate cleanly into modern language, but that the honest version of this story cannot leave out. It says she wanted to go because there were young men on the ship, and because she had never let an opportunity of that kind pass her by. She bought her passage the only way she had to pay for things, and she sailed north toward a city that would do to her what Alexandria, for all its noise and heat and 17 years of trying, had never managed to do. It would make her stop. There is an old idea, older than Christianity, older than most of the religions that have claimed Jerusalem as their own, that certain places on earth are different from other places, that the ground itself holds something, that standing in a specific location can do something to a person that standing anywhere else cannot do. Most people who traveled to Jerusalem in the 5th century believed this in the straightforward way that people believe things they have been taught since childhood. They believed the city was holy. They believed that proximity to the places where sacred events had occurred would bring them closer to the God they worshipped. They had saved money for years to make the journey. They had prayed in preparation. They had organized their entire understanding of what the trip meant before they set foot on the ship. Mary had not done any of that. She stood on the deck as Alexandria shrank behind her and felt nothing in particular about where she was going. Jerusalem was a direction. It was away from the familiar, which was the main thing she had ever asked of any destination. She had been in Alexandria for 17 years and had exhausted it in the way that certain kinds of people exhaust places, not by seeing everything, but by running out of ways to be surprised by it. A new city was a new crowd. A new crowd was a new supply of the thing she ran on. The ship carried pilgrims from several different cities along the Mediterranean coast. They were a mixed group: merchants and minor clergy and families who had been planning this journey for years. But they shared the particular quality of people moving towards something they considered sacred. They prayed together in the evenings. They talked about what they expected to find. They had the focused, slightly elevated quality of people who believe the journey they are on is the most important journey they will ever make. Mary moved among them the way she had always moved among people, easily and without friction, finding the ones who were lonely or restless or simply glad to have company on a long sea crossing. She was good at reading a room, or in this case a ship, good at finding the current in any social situation and moving with it rather than against it. It was one of the things she was genuinely skilled at, and she had been doing it long enough that it required almost no conscious effort. The Mediterranean crossing took several weeks. The days had a rhythm of wind and water and the slow passage of coastlines on the horizon. At night the stars were very clear. During the days there was time, which was the thing Mary had spent 17 years making sure she never had too much of. She had too much of it now. There is something about being on open water that strips away the mechanisms people use to avoid their own thoughts. The city provides constant interruption. The ship provided almost none. The pilgrims around her had their prayers and their anticipation and their conversations about what Jerusalem would mean. Mary had the water and the sky, and the thing she had been moving fast enough to not hear for 17 years, which was now, in the quiet of the open sea, beginning to be audible. She did not examine it directly. She was not ready to do that, but it was there. A low frequency underneath everything, the sound of a question she had never answered and had never quite been able to outrun. She arrived in Jerusalem the way she arrived everywhere, on her feet, looking forward, carrying the momentum of a person who has not yet decided to stop. The city was different from what she had expected, though she had not expected much specifically. Jerusalem in the 5th century was a city that had been built and destroyed and rebuilt so many times that the layers of history were almost physically visible, each century pressing down on the ones before it. The Romans had rebuilt it after their destruction of the Jewish temple in the year 70. Constantine had built Christian churches over the sites identified with the life of Jesus. The city had become, in the 2 centuries since Constantine, a destination rather than simply a place. A city whose economy and identity were organized around the fact that people came from everywhere to stand inside it. The streets were full of pilgrims from every corner of the Christian world. Languages Mary had never heard. Faces from places she could not have named on a map. And underneath all of it, the particular weight of a place that has been considered sacred for long enough that the sacredness has become structural, part of the architecture, present in the quality of light on the old stone. Mary felt none of this in the way the people around her felt it, or almost none of it. There was something, she would describe it later as a discomfort she could not locate, a feeling of being slightly wrong in a way she could not explain. Not guilt. Exactly. She was not a person who spent much time with guilt. Something more like the sensation of being in a place where the rules she had always operated by did not quite apply, where the competence she had built over 17 years was somehow not the relevant competence. She ignored it. She was very good at ignoring things she did not have a category for. The feast was several days away. The pilgrims dispersed through the city to pray and visit the holy sites and prepare themselves for the central observance. Mary moved through the city with them, seeing what they saw, standing in the places they stood, feeling what she felt, which was not what they felt, and which she could not entirely explain even to herself. She visited the church of the Holy Sepulchre before the feast day. She walked through its doors without difficulty. She stood in the space that tradition identified as the site of the crucifixion and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus. She looked at the other pilgrims around her, at the quality of attention on their faces, the particular stillness that comes over people when they are in a place they have been waiting their whole lives to stand. She did not feel that stillness. What she felt was closer to the sensation of standing outside a conversation in a language she did not speak. She could see that something was happening. She could see that it was real for the people around her. She could not access it. It was on the other side of something she could not name. She left the church and walked back into the streets of Jerusalem and told herself it did not matter. She had not come here for the religious experience. She had come because the ship was going here and the pilgrims were going here, and she had never been good at staying in one place when there was movement available. The feast day arrived. The city filled in a way that even Jerusalem in the 5th century did not usually fill. Thousands of people moving toward the church from every direction. A human river flowing through streets that had been designed for a smaller crowd. Mary moved with them because moving with the crowd was the thing she knew how to do. She found herself near the front of the press of bodies, approaching the entrance to the church. The doors were open. The people in front of her crossed the threshold and disappeared inside. She reached the entrance and stopped. Her body arrived at the threshold and would not cross it. The way a person's hand will stop before touching a flame. Some part of them knowing before the conscious mind has caught up that crossing that distance is not possible. She stepped back, let more people through, tried again. The same thing. She stood at the entrance to the church of the Holy Sepulchre while the feast proceeded inside, and she could not enter, and she did not understand why. And the question she had been out running for 17 years was no longer running in the background. It was standing directly in front of her. What she did next was not what you would expect from a woman who had spent 2 decades moving away from stillness. It was not what she would have expected from herself. She stopped fighting the door. She turned around. She found a corner of the vestibule, a small space away from the main flow of the crowd, where an icon of Mary, the mother of Jesus, hung on the wall in the particular darkness that old churches hold even in the middle of the day, and she stood in front of it and did not move. The story of what happened next has been carried for 1500 years inside a specific kind of document. The life of Mary of Egypt was written by Sophronius of Jerusalem in the 7th century. Sophronius was the patriarch of the city during one of its most catastrophic periods. The man who surrendered Jerusalem to the Arab conquest in 637. He was a theologian of considerable precision who had spent his life thinking carefully about what was true and what was not, and what the difference between those two things cost. He chose to write this story down. He chose to preserve it with the same care he brought to his doctrinal treatises and his letters on Christology. That choice tells you something about how he understood what he was preserving. He believed it was doing work that nothing else in the tradition was doing. What Sophronius recorded was the account Zosimas carried out of the desert, which was the account Mary had given Zosimas of her own life. What we have is a story that passed through at least 2 human memories and 2 centuries of time before it was written down. The honest way to hold what comes next is to hold it the way the tradition holds it, as something believed to be true, rather than something provable in the terms that a modern court would recognize. What the tradition believed to be true was this: Mary stood in front of the icon, and she prayed the way a person prays when they have run out of every other option. The life records the shape of what she said. She named what she was. She did not dress it up. She said she knew she was not worthy to look at the image of the Mother of God, that she knew what she had done with her body and her life, that she was not asking to be treated as if those things had not happened. She was asking for a door, just that, a way through, not absolution, not a clean record, not the 17 years handed back to her, a way through the entrance she had been unable to cross. And then she waited in the way that people wait when they have said everything they have and are standing in the silence that follows it. What happened next is the center of the entire story, and it is also the place where the story becomes most resistant to the tools we normally use to understand things. The tradition says that after she prayed, she felt something change, a warmth. The life says that moved through her body like light through water, a loosening of something that had been held very tight for a very long time, a sense, as sudden and as specific as the sensation of stepping out of a dark building into sunlight. That the thing blocking her was no longer blocking her. She turned from the icon and walked toward the entrance of the church. She crossed the threshold. She went inside. Now, here is the question that matters more than whether the warmth was literal or metaphorical. More than whether what she experienced has a neurological explanation or a supernatural one. Why that moment? Mary had not changed between the first time she tried the door and the moment she crossed it. The 17 years were still the 17 years. She had not completed any ritual of purification. She had not promised to be different. She had stood in a corner in front of an old image on a wall and said what was true and asked for what she needed. And something opened. The theological tradition that preserved this story has a specific way of talking about what happened. It uses the word grace, and grace, in the Eastern Christian understanding, is not a reward. It is not something you earn by accumulating enough good behavior to tip the scales in your favor. It moves more like weather than commerce. It comes when it comes. It does not consult your record before arriving. It is not proportional to your preparation. This is the idea that makes Mary's story so difficult for certain kinds of religious sensibility, and so necessary for others. For the person who believes that spiritual life is primarily a matter of discipline and effort, and the slow accumulation of virtue, her story is almost offensive. She did nothing right. She prepared nothing. She was at a holy site for reasons that had nothing to do with holiness. She had spent 17 years doing the opposite of what the tradition would have recommended as preparation for a moment like this. And then the moment came anyway. For the person who has spent years doing everything right and still feels the door is closed. That fact is not offensive at all. It is the most important fact in the world. But here is what the tradition also does not let you forget, and what the comfortable version of this story tends to leave out. The door opened, and on the other side of the door was not rest. On the other side of the door was a direction. Go to the Jordan. Cross it. Stay with what you find there. She was standing inside the church of the Holy Sepulchre for the first time. She had just crossed a threshold that had been physically impossible for her to cross 20 minutes earlier. The natural human response to that situation is to stay, to hold onto the place where the impossible thing happened, to remain in its vicinity for as long as possible. The direction she received was to go further, further from the city, further from people, further from everything that the last 17 years had been made of, across the Jordan River and into the desert on the other side, which in the 5th century was not a romantic landscape of spiritual retreat, but an actual wilderness, genuinely hostile to human survival. The kind of place that people entered only when they had a very specific reason to, and did not always return from. Mary had just found the first door she could cross in 17 years, and what waited on the other side of it was not a room, it was a desert. She stayed in Jerusalem long enough to receive communion at the Church of St. John the Baptist, which the tradition records as her first communion. Think about what that means for a moment without rushing past it. A woman who had spent 17 years outside every boundary the church recognized, who had arrived in Jerusalem for reasons that had nothing to do with the church, who had been stopped at the church door by something she did not have a name for, was now, hours later, receiving the central sacrament of the Christian faith for what appears to have been the first time in her adult life. The tradition does not editorialize about this. It does not congratulate her or explain what it means. It simply records that it happened and moves on, which is itself a kind of statement, as if the tradition understood that some things are diminished by commentary. She left Jerusalem the next morning. She walked to the Jordan River, and she crossed it, and she went into the desert on the other side. The tradition does not tell us what she thought when she crossed the Jordan. It does not record a speech or a prayer or a declaration of intention. It simply says she went, which is, when you think about it, the most honest thing it could say. Because the most important crossings in a human life are rarely accompanied by the right words. You do not usually know, in the moment of crossing, what you are crossing into. You know what you are leaving. You know the door is behind you. You know the direction is forward. Mary walked forward. The desert opened ahead of her, and the longest, hardest, most invisible chapter of her life began without ceremony, without witnesses, without anyone to confirm that what she was doing was real or meaningful or going anywhere at all. That was the point. That was always the point. Here is something that the comfortable version of this story never tells you. The desert almost broke her. The physical desert was real and brutal in ways that are difficult to fully imagine from the distance of 15 centuries. The Jordanian wilderness east of the river was not a landscape designed for human survival. It was rock and sand and heat that in summer reached temperatures that killed unprepared travelers within hours. There was almost no water. There was almost no shade. There was nothing that the human body needs. and almost everything that destroys it. Mary survived the physical desert. That part of the tradition is clear. She lived in it for 47 years, and she was alive. Barely. When Zosimas found her near the end of that time, something in her body was capable of enduring what the landscape demanded. What almost broke her was not the landscape. It was the silence. In Alexandria, silence had been the enemy. She had spent 17 years making sure there was never enough of it to hear what it contained. The city had been cooperative in this, offering an endless supply of noise and company, and the particular velocity of a life organized around appetite. She had become expert at maintaining a pace that kept the quiet at a safe distance. The desert had no interest in cooperating. On the first night east of the Jordan, with the river behind her and nothing in front of her but rock and darkness and the sound of her own breathing, the silence arrived in full, and with it came everything she had been storing on the other side of it for 17 years. The tradition describes what followed not as peace but as war. Sophronius records Mary's own account of those early years in the desert, the account she gave Zosimas centuries later. And the account is not the account of a woman who had found serenity. It is the account of a woman who was being taken apart, and who did not know if there would be anything left when the taking apart was finished. She heard music, not actual music. The tradition is clear that she was alone, but the memory of music, specific songs from specific nights in Alexandria, so vivid that she could feel the rooms they had played in, the warmth of the bodies around her, the particular pleasure of a night that had no agenda beyond itself. The memories were not gentle, they were urgent. They pressed against her with something close to physical force. They told her, in the language that the deepest parts of the mind speak when they want to be heard, that what she had left was real, and what she had come to was nothing. She wanted wine. The life records this with a specificity that feels almost shocking in a sacred text. Not the abstract desire for comfort, the specific bodily desire for wine, for the taste and the warmth and the particular softening of the edges of things that wine provided. She had organized large portions of her life around that softening. The desert offered nothing that softened anything. It only sharpened. She wanted the company of men. The tradition says this plainly, and the honesty of it is part of what makes the account remarkable. This was a woman who had lived that life with her whole body for 17 years, and her body had not forgotten it and was not interested in forgetting it, simply because she had crossed a river. The physical hunger was real. The memories were real. The voice that told her to go back was real in the way that the most persuasive voices always are. Which is to say, it was not wrong about everything. It was right that what she had left was real. It was right that what the desert was offering, which appeared to be nothing, was in some important sense actually nothing. What the voice could not see, because it was speaking from inside the life she had been living, was that the nothing was the point. She did not have a clear understanding of this in those early years. She was not operating from a worked-out theology of desert spirituality. She was not following a program designed by someone who had mapped the territory before her. She was following the direction she had received at the Jordan, and she was staying with it, the way you stay with something when you have run out of alternatives, which is not the same as staying with it out of wisdom, but which is sometimes, in the strange economy of how human beings are remade, just as effective. She prayed in those early years the way a drowning person grabs at anything within reach. not the composed, structured prayer of someone who has been practicing it for decades. The desperate, incoherent prayer of someone who has nothing else. She fell on the ground. She wept. She addressed the woman whose icon had been on the wall in the vestibule of the church, the one she had spoken to before the door opened. And she said things that did not resolve into clean theological statements, but that were true in the way that only things said at the absolute limit of a person's resources are true. And she stayed. This is what the early years of Mary's desert life come down to. Stripped of all the drama and the detail, she stayed. Not because it was working in any way she could measure, not because the memories faded quickly, or the physical hunger resolved itself, or the silence became comfortable. She stayed because the door at the church in Jerusalem had been real, and the direction she had received after crossing it had been real. And she had no framework for what real meant in those terms, except to keep moving in the direction she had been given. The tradition does not tell us how many times she almost left. It does not record the mornings when she woke up with the Jordan close enough to hear and the road back to Alexandria theoretically available. It preserves the fact that she did not leave, which implies the decision not to leave was made more than once. Probably many more times than once. In those early years, when the war was loudest and the evidence that she was doing the right thing was essentially non-existent. This is the part of Mary's story that modern retellings tend to move through too quickly, as if the early years in the desert are just a transition, a dramatic setup for the holy woman she eventually became. They are not a transition. They are the heart of it. Because the question the early years are answering is the question that everyone who has ever tried to change something real about themselves eventually arrives at. The question is not whether change is possible in principle. The question is whether change is possible for you, specifically, in your specific body, with your specific history, against the specific resistance that your specific life has built up over the specific number of years you have been living it. Mary's desert was her specific answer to that question. Not a general answer, not a philosophical argument, a lived answer, made out of days and nights, and hunger and memory and the decision, repeated until it became something other than a decision. To stay. The second phase came without announcement. There was no morning when she woke up and knew that something had shifted. The tradition does not give us a date or a dramatic turning point. What it gives us is a change in the quality of the account itself, a different texture in how Mary described this period to Zosimas. Less urgent, less like a war report, and more like a description of a landscape that has become, without quite being comfortable, familiar. The memories did not disappear. She would be clear about this later. The desire did not vanish. The body does not forget what it has learned over 17 years. And a desert, however absolute, is not an eraser. What changed was something harder to name. The memories began to arrive without the same force. The way a storm that has been battering a structure for a long time begins to lose the ability to surprise the structure with its violence. Not because the storm has stopped, but because the structure has learned, through the repeated experience of surviving it, that it can in fact survive it. This is not the same as peace. It is something quieter and less dramatic than peace, but in some ways more durable. It is the difference between a fear that controls you and a fear that you have lived with long enough to know the shape of. She prayed differently in this second phase, not with the drowning urgency of the early years, with something more like conversation, halting and uncertain, but two-directional, in a way that the early prayers had not quite been. She was not only speaking into the dark, She was beginning, tentatively, to listen to what the dark said back. What the dark said back is not something the tradition records in detail. This is appropriate. The tradition preserves the outside of Mary's story, the contours of what happened and when, with Zosimas as its single witness. What happened in the interior of those years was between Mary and the desert, and whatever the desert was a medium for, and it was not fully translatable into the language Zosimas was writing in. And Sophronius, working 2 centuries later from Zosimas's account, understood that some of it was not his to translate. What the tradition does preserve is the fact that she stopped fighting, not in the sense of giving up, in the sense that the war in the early years had been a war of resistance, a battle to hold her position against the force of what she was trying to leave behind. And at some point, in the middle years of her desert life, the resistance became something else, a decision to stop trying to control the outcome and to simply be present to what was actually happening, which was, in the middle of the desert, with no audience and no confirmation and no way to measure progress, a far more radical act than it sounds. The physical world of the desert became, in this middle period, something she existed in rather than something she was surviving. She knew where water could be found. She knew what the landscape looked and sounded like in every season. She had become, in the way that humans become things, when they have no choice but to fully inhabit a context, a person who belonged to that specific place in a way she had never quite belonged to Alexandria. For all that she had lived there for 17 years, Alexandria had been a city she moved through. The desert was a place she inhabited. The difference between those two things is the difference between the life before the Jordan and the life after it. And that difference did not happen at the moment she crossed the river. It accumulated, slowly and without ceremony, across years of mornings and evenings that left no record anywhere, except in the person who lived them. The third phase is the hardest to write about. What Zosimas could see, when he finally found her near the end of her 47 years, was the result of a process he had no language for, and could only describe by describing what was no longer present. The fear was gone. The urgency was gone. The need to be somewhere other than where she was, which had driven her from Egypt to Alexandria, to Jerusalem, to the Jordan, and finally into this desert, had been replaced by something he had spent 53 years in religious life learning to want and had not yet fully found. She was simply what she was. Most of us, even the most sincere, carry a version of ourselves that is slightly adjusted for the audience we are with. We modulate, we present, we manage the impression we make. Not always dishonestly, but consistently. It is so automatic that we stop noticing we are doing it. Mary, after 47 years in a desert with no audience, had lost the habit entirely. She was not performing holiness for Zosimas when he found her. She was not performing anything at all. And that absence of performance was, for a man who had spent his entire adult life in religious community, surrounded by people who were trying very hard to be holy, one of the most startling things he had ever encountered. The tradition says she could quote scripture she had never formally studied. It says she walked across the surface of the Jordan to meet him, which is the kind of detail that hagiography reaches for when it is trying to say something about a person that ordinary language cannot quite hold. Whether you read that literally or symbolically, the point is the same. She had become, in the absolute privacy of the desert, something that the world she had left behind had no framework for, and she had done it with no one watching, no teacher confirming she was on the right path, no community measuring her progress against a standard, no mirror of any kind, external or communal, reflecting back to her who she was becoming, just the desert, and the years, and the daily, unwitnessed decision to keep going in the direction she had been given. Here is the question that the 47 years in the desert force you to ask. And it is a question this story raises more directly than almost any other story in the history of Christian hagiography. We live in a world that does not believe in unwitnessed transformation. We have built an entire culture around the idea that change requires accountability, that growth needs to be documented, that a redemption arc is only real when it has an audience. We post about our journeys. We ask our communities to hold us responsible. We measure progress by the feedback of the people around us. Because without that feedback, how do we know the progress is real? Mary of Egypt spent 47 years answering that question. Her answer was not a philosophical argument. It was a life that no one saw, that no one confirmed, that no one validated or measured or held accountable to any external standard. A life lived entirely in the space between her and whatever she was moving toward. And then, near the very end of it, one person came. Not because she sought him out, not because she had decided it was time to be found, but because the tradition, which had been carrying the question her life was an answer to, needed a witness, not to confirm that the transformation had happened. It had happened, and it would have happened whether Zosimas came or not, but to carry the question back into the world where the rest of us live, where the answers are never that clean, and the deserts are never that empty, and the 47 years are never available to us. Zosimas came into the desert looking for something to teach him. He found something that would spend the rest of his life teaching him. He was not ready for what he found. He almost never was. Zosimas of Palestine had been a monk for 53 years. He had entered monastic life as a child, which was not unusual in the 5th century, when families of faith sometimes gave their sons to religious communities the way other families gave their sons to trade apprenticeships. He had grown up inside the rhythms of a life organized entirely around prayer and scripture, and the slow, disciplined work of becoming a person whose interior life was, as much as human effort could make it, aligned with God. He was good at it. This is important to say clearly, because the story of Zosimas is not the story of a fraud or a hypocrite, or a man who had been performing virtue he did not actually possess. He was the real thing. He fasted with genuine commitment. He prayed with genuine attention. He read scripture with genuine seriousness, and had spent decades thinking carefully about what it meant and what it demanded. The community he lived in respected him, not because he was charismatic or politically skilled, but because when people watched how he lived, they saw a person who was doing the hard work and not faking it. He had also, somewhere in his 53rd year of doing the hard work, begun to have a thought he did not feel entirely comfortable having. It arrived quietly, the way the most dangerous thoughts usually arrive. Not as a sudden declaration, but as a small question that kept returning at inconvenient moments. The question was something like this. He had been at this for 53 years. He had given everything the life required of him. He had learned from every teacher available to him, and he was beginning to wonder, in the private corners of his mind that he did not share with his brothers, whether there was anyone left who could show him something he had not already seen. He would not have named this as pride. It did not feel like pride. It felt like an honest assessment of where he was after 5 decades of serious effort. He had gone far. He could feel how far he had gone. The question was whether there was further to go, and if so, whether he had the guides available to take him there. The tradition records that he received a kind of interior prompting that he understood as divine direction, telling him to leave his monastery and travel to a community near the Jordan River, where he would spend the season of Lent. The prompt included a suggestion that he would find there what his current community could no longer give him. He went. This detail is worth examining, because it tells you something essential about Zosimas that is easy to miss. A man who had secretly concluded that there was nothing left for him to learn would not have responded to a direction telling him to go somewhere to learn. He would have found reasons to stay where he was. Or he would have gone and observed the new community with the detached appreciation of someone who has already completed the curriculum. The fact that he responded with what the tradition describes as genuine hope suggests that the thought he had been having was not the settled arrogance of a man who believed he had arrived. It was the restless uncertainty of a man who had gone far enough to know that the map he had been using might not show all the territory. There is a difference between those two things, and that difference is the difference between a person who can still be surprised and a person who cannot. Zosimas could still be surprised. The community near the Jordan received him. It had its own particular tradition, one that included an unusual practice. Each year, at the beginning of Lent, the monks would cross the Jordan River and spend the weeks before Easter dispersed in the desert on the other side, alone, without the structure and companionship of communal life. They would return for Holy Week. The practice was understood as a form of intensification, a way of stripping away the comfort of community and forcing each monk into a more direct encounter with whatever the desert had to say. Zosimas crossed the Jordan with the others and then separated from them and went his own way into the desert. He walked for 20 days. The desert east of the Jordan was not a hospitable landscape. For Zosimas, a man in his late 70s who had spent most of his life within the walls of a monastery, the physical demands of those 20 days were significant. But he was a trained ascetic, which means he had been deliberately uncomfortable at regular intervals for 5 decades. And his body knew how to manage deprivation in ways that a less disciplined person's would not. What he was not prepared for was what he saw on the 20th day. The tradition describes it as a shadow, something moving at the edge of his vision, at a distance that made it impossible to immediately identify. He stopped walking. He looked. The shape was human, or approximately human, but barely, thin to the point of translucency, white hair that fell to the ground, skin darkened and roughened by decades of exposure to a sun that does not negotiate, moving away from him with a speed that seemed inconsistent with a body that looked as fragile as this one did. Zosimas did what any person does when they see something unexpected in a place where they expected to be alone. He ran toward it. The figure ran away from him. He called out. He ran harder. The distance between them did not close in the way it should have closed, between a person running at full speed and a figure that looked as if it should barely be able to walk. The tradition reads this as something other than a foot race, as if the question of whether Zosimas would reach her was not primarily a question of relative physical speed. And then she stopped. She spoke to him from a distance across the rocky terrain. She knew his name. She called him Zosimas. He had not told her his name. He had not told her anything. He had been chasing a figure he could barely see across a desert landscape. And now the figure was speaking to him in a normal human voice and using his name. She told him she was a sinful woman. She asked him to throw her his cloak because she had no clothing. Having arrived in the desert with the garments she had on when she left Jerusalem, which after 47 years of desert sun and wind were no longer in a condition to be described as garments, he threw it. She covered herself, and then she did something that Zosimas would spend the rest of his life trying to fully understand. She asked him to pray with her. Not for her, with her, as if the 53 years of monastic formation he had brought into the desert were not something she needed to receive from him, but something she wanted to stand beside. He knelt. She knelt. He prayed. And Sophronius records that when Zosimas finally opened his eyes, Mary was elevated from the ground, not by much. The text is modest about the distance, but elevated in a way that was visible and unambiguous to a man who had spent 53 years learning to distrust the evidence of his senses when his desires were involved, and who was therefore, when he reported this, reporting something he had specifically tried to explain away before he accepted that it was real. He was frightened. The tradition uses that word without apology. A man of 53 years of spiritual formation, confronted with something that exceeded the boundaries of everything that formation had prepared him for, was afraid. This is one of the most honest moments in the entire story, because Zosimas's fear at that moment is not the fear of a coward. It is the fear of a person who has just discovered that the map he has been using for 53 years, the map he thought was very good, does not show all the territory. There is land on the other side of the edge of the map, and he is standing in it. And the woman kneeling in front of him has been living there for 47 years. She sensed his fear. She addressed it directly. She told him she was not a spirit. She was a woman. And then, with a directness that the hagiography records without editorial comment, she told him she was going to tell him her story, not because she wanted him to know it, because she wanted him to carry it. There is a decision buried in this moment that almost every retelling of Mary of Egypt steps past without noticing. And it is the most important decision in the second half of her life. Mary had spent 47 years choosing not to be seen, not by accident, not by circumstance, but by deliberate and sustained choice. She had crossed the Jordan and gone into the desert, and she had not come back. Not even when the worst years were behind her. She had lived in a complete absence of human witness. And she had not merely survived that absence. She had, by every measure the tradition has for measuring such things, flourished in it. And now she was choosing, with the same deliberateness that had kept her in the desert, to be seen by one person, for one purpose. Why? The tradition does not give Zosimas her explanation. It gives us her actions, which is perhaps more honest. She told him her story. She asked him, before he left, to return the following year with the Eucharist, the communion sacrament. She asked him to tell no one about her until after she was dead. That last request is the key to understanding why she told him anything at all. She was not breaking her 47 years of hiddenness. She was completing them. She was making a single, specific provision for what would happen after she was gone, which was that the question she had been living would not die with her body in the sand. Someone needed to know it had been lived, not to make her famous, not to build her a shrine or put her name in a calendar, but because a question that has been lived at that depth and that cost deserves to continue existing in the world after the person who lived it is no longer there to embody it. She chose Zosimas because he was the only one who had come, but she also chose him because she could see that he was the kind of person who would be changed by what she told him, who would carry it not as information but as weight, who would spend the rest of his life understanding it more deeply, which is the only way a story like this one gets carried forward faithfully. He listened to everything. She told him about Alexandria. She told him about the ship and the pilgrims and the door that would not open. She told him about the icon and the prayer and the warmth that had moved through her like light through water. She told him about the 47 years on the other side of the Jordan, the early years of war and the middle years of slow, unwitnessed transformation and the later years of something she did not have a word for. And so she described it by describing what was no longer present: the fear, the urgency, the need to be somewhere other than where she was. Zosimas listened the way a person listens when they understand that they are hearing something they will not hear again, with his whole attention, without the part of the mind that is already formulating a response or drawing a comparison to something it already knows. That part of his mind had gone quiet, which was, for a man of his formation and his confidence, an unusual state. He had come into the desert believing he was looking for a higher experience of the spiritual life. He had found a woman who had already arrived at a place he did not have a name for. He had come in carrying 53 years of carefully acquired knowledge about the interior life. She had spoken for a few hours, and he understood that there were entire regions of that life that his 53 years had not reached. He was not diminished by this. That is the thing about an encounter with something genuinely larger than yourself. If you are the right kind of person, and Zosimas was the right kind of person, it does not make you smaller. It makes the thing you have been building toward for 53 years suddenly legible in a new way. As if a room you have been navigating by candlelight has had a window opened, and you can see for the first time what the walls are actually made of. He did not want to leave. She told him to go. She would not be there if he stayed, and she asked him again to come back the following year, to the bank of the Jordan on the Thursday of the last week before Easter, with the Eucharist. He went. He crossed the Jordan and returned to the monastery, and he did not, as she had asked, speak about what he had encountered. He carried it quietly through the months that followed, the way you carry something that is still changing shape inside you, that you are not yet ready to put into words, because the words would fix it before it has finished becoming what it is going to become. He thought about her in the way that a student thinks about a teacher who has given them something they will spend years understanding, not with the gratitude that resolves into a kind of closure, with the kind of attention that keeps finding new dimensions in what it received. A word she had used, a way she had described something, the particular quality of stillness in her face when she was listening, as if she were listening to something behind his words as well as to the words themselves. He thought about what she had asked him to bring, the Eucharist, the central sacrament of the faith, the thing she could have received had she stayed in any Christian community anywhere. At any point in the 47 years she had been in the desert, She had chosen instead to live without it for 47 years and to ask for it now. At the end, from a single monk she had met once in a wilderness. There is a way of reading that request as a final gesture of belonging to the church whose door she had once been unable to enter. And there is another way of reading it that seems truer, which is that she was not performing belonging. She was completing a circle. The first thing she had done after the door opened in Jerusalem was receive communion at the church of John the Baptist. The last thing she was going to do before she died was receive it again, in the desert, from the hands of a man who had found her by accident and stayed to listen. Beginning and end, both sacramental, both outside the ordinary structures of religious life as it was lived by the people who had never done what she had done. The year turned. Lent came again. The monks crossed the Jordan and dispersed into the desert. Zosimas went to the bank of the river on the Thursday before Easter, as she had asked. She was there. She walked toward him, across the surface of the water. He stood on the bank and watched her come and did not try to explain it. He was past trying to explain things that exceeded the edges of his map. He held out the Eucharist. She received it with a quality of attention that he would later describe as the most complete attention he had ever seen directed at anything. As if the entirety of her 47 years had been a preparation for this particular moment. This particular cup, this particular standing on the bank of the Jordan in the last light of a Lenten evening. She asked him to come back the following year, to the same place. She said he would find what God had prepared. He crossed the river again. He did not know, as he walked away, that she was already saying goodbye. He would not understand that until the following year, when he made the walk back to the Jordan with the spring light coming through the desert air, and found her lying in the sand, with her face turned east and her hands folded, and the stillness of a body that has finished its last conversation. But that is the next chapter, and it begins, as all endings do, with someone arriving too late to say the things they meant to say, and finding that the things they meant to say had already been said. He almost did not go back, not because he had forgotten, not because the year that passed between his two visits to the desert had diminished what he had experienced there. If anything, the year had done the opposite. The encounter with Mary had continued to work on him the way that the most important encounters always continue to work, not reaching a point of completion, but opening new rooms every time he thought he had found the last one. He thought about her constantly. He prayed for her. He held the things she had told him about the early years in the desert, and the later years, and the quality of the silence she had described. And every time he returned to those things he found something in them he had not found the time before. He went back because she had asked him to, and because in 53 years of religious life, Zosimas had learned that the requests of people who know more than you do should be honored, even when you do not fully understand why they are making them. He crossed the Jordan when the season came. He walked into the desert. He walked to the place she had told him to come, the bank of the river, at the edge of the wilderness, where she had received the Eucharist the year before. He found her lying on the ground. Her face was turned east, toward Jerusalem, toward the direction of the rising sun, toward the direction that the Christian tradition has always associated with the return of Christ and the orientation of prayer. Her hands were folded across her body. Her eyes were closed. She was arranged with a precision that seemed deliberate, as if she had lain down carefully and intentionally in the posture in which she intended to be found. she was dead. She had been dead for some time. The desert had begun the process. That deserts begin with everything that stops moving in them. Zosimas knelt beside her. The tradition records that he wept, not quietly, with the specific grief of a person who has lost someone they did not have nearly enough time with, which is a particular kind of grief, because it contains inside it the awareness of everything that was not said, and everything that was not asked, and everything that could have been learned if there had been more time, and there was not more time, and now there never would be. He had known her for 2 evenings and a single sacrament on a riverbank. He had spent the intervening year understanding that those 2 evenings and that sacrament had been among the most significant encounters of his entire life. And now she was gone, and the desert was very quiet. And he was an old man, kneeling in the sand next to a body that had survived 47 years of conditions that should have destroyed it much sooner. He had come to bring her communion. He was too late. And then he saw the writing. The tradition says there were words in the sand near her head. Whether written with her finger before she died or placed there by another means, the text does not specify. The words were a request. They asked Zosimas to bury her. They said she had died on the night she had received the Eucharist from him at the Jordan, which meant she had crossed the desert back to this place and had lain down and died in the hours after the sacrament. And the body he was kneeling beside had been here for a full year in the desert that had been her home. She had known she was going to die that night. The words in the sand were not written in surprise or panic. They were written with the same deliberateness that had characterized everything about her since Zosimas had found her the year before. She had arranged her affairs. She had received what she had waited 47 years to receive again. She had walked back to the place she wanted to be found. She had written the instruction she needed Zosimas to have, and then she had died, on her own terms, in her own place, without ceremony, and without audience, and without anything except the desert and the night and whatever she had spent 47 years moving toward. Zosimas tried to dig a grave. He was an old man with his hands, and the desert floor was rock and hardened earth in the way that desert floors tend to be. And after a long time of trying, he had moved very little, and the sun was moving across the sky in the direction of evening. And he sat back and understood that he was not going to be able to do this alone. The tradition says a lion came. It came out of the deeper desert, a large male, and it went to the body of Mary and stayed beside her in the way that the tradition understands as an act of mourning or recognition. And then it went to the ground beside the body and began to dig, with its paws in the hard desert floor, digging in a way that Zosimas with his old hands could not have managed, until the hole was deep enough to be a grave. Then it stopped. It looked at Zosimas. It walked back into the desert and did not look back. The lion is the kind of detail that hagiography reaches for when ordinary language has run out of room. Whether you read it as literal event or as the tradition's way of saying something it could not otherwise say, the image holds. The desert buried its own, the wilderness that had taken everything from Mary and given her everything she became in return. That wilderness showed up at the end to do the one thing she could not do for herself. Zosimas buried her. He covered her with sand and arranged what stones he could find over the mound, the way graves in that landscape were marked. He prayed over her with the words he had. He stood for a long time in the desert that had held her for 47 years, and that was now holding her still, in a different way, permanently. He crossed the Jordan and returned to his community. And then, because she had told him to, he told them everything. He did not tell the story the way a person tells a story they have already understood. He told it the way a person tells a story they are still inside, still being changed by, still finding new rooms in every time they walk through it again. He told it with the specific quality of attention that the most important truths require. The kind of attention that says, this is not information I am passing along. This is something I am handing you, because it is too heavy and too important to carry alone. The community received it. They received it as communities receive things that exceed their categories, with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty, and the particular seriousness that settles over a group of people when they understand that what they are hearing is going to stay with them. The story spread from Zosimas' community to other communities in Palestine and Egypt, from the desert communities to the cities, from the 5th century to the 6th and then to the 7th. When Sophronius of Jerusalem encountered the account and understood that it needed to be written down with more care and more fullness than the oral tradition could sustain. Sophronius was not a sentimental man. He was the patriarch of Jerusalem during one of the most catastrophic periods in the city's history, presiding over the community that surrendered the city to the Arab conquest in 637. He had written extensively on theology and Christology, and the relationship between faith and reason. He was not the kind of person who preserved stories because they were moving or because they reflected well on the tradition. He preserved Mary's story because he believed it was true, and because he believed it was doing something that nothing else in the theological literature was doing. The Christian tradition makes an enormous claim about the scope of grace. It says that the love of God is not proportional to human merit. It says that the gap between what a person has done and what grace can do with a person is not a gap that human calculation can measure. These claims are easy to affirm in principle. They are very difficult to actually believe in relation to a specific human life that has gone a specific distance in a specific direction. Mary of Egypt is the tradition's answer to that difficulty. Not a philosophical answer. A life. A specific life. With a specific history. In a specific city. Making specific choices over 17 specific years. Arriving at a specific door she could not cross. Crossing it. And then spending 47 specific years on the other side, in a transformation that no human system measured or validated or confirmed. Sophronius understood that this kind of answer is more durable than any argument. Arguments can be countered. Lives can only be lived or not lived. And Mary's life, with all its weight and all its specificity and all its absolute refusal to be anyone's easy illustration of anything, was a life that the tradition needed to keep. So he kept it. He wrote it with the care of someone who understood that the document he was producing would outlast him by centuries. That readers whose world he could not imagine would open it and find inside it the same question that the original had been written to carry. He kept Mary's voice where he could hear it. The voice Zosimas had preserved. The account she had given of Alexandria and the ship and the door and the desert. He kept the specificity of it. The wine she had craved. The music she had heard in the early years. The way the memories had pressed against her in the desert before they lost their urgency. He understood that the specificity was not incidental to the story. It was the story. A Mary who craved wine and music was a Mary who was real. A real Mary was the only Mary who could carry a real question. The story moved through the Eastern Christian tradition, the way the stories that are doing real work always move, not as a document, but as a living thing, carried by communities that needed it for reasons they did not always articulate, but felt very clearly. It was incorporated into the liturgical life of the Orthodox Church in a way that very few hagiographic accounts have been. Her feast day is the 1st of April. She is commemorated on the 5th Sunday of Lent every year, during the period of the liturgical calendar that the tradition has always understood as the time when the deepest questions are in season. The great canon of Andrew of Crete, one of the longest and most searching penitential texts in the Eastern tradition, uses Mary of Egypt as a central figure, not as a cautionary tale, but as a witness, a person who testifies by having lived. In the iconographic tradition, she is depicted old, very thin, dark from the desert sun. Her face in the icons carries an expression that the best iconographers render with great care, because it is not an expression that maps easily onto the categories the tradition has for depicting saints. It is not serenity. Exactly. It is not joy in the way that other saints are depicted as joyful. It is something quieter and more costly than either of those things. Something that looks like what remains in a face after a very long time of being completely honest about very difficult things in the company of only the desert. And whatever the desert is a medium for, she is still in the calendar. She is still read on the 5th Sunday of Lent in Orthodox churches around the world. She is still doing what she has always done, which is to hold open a question that the tradition keeps wanting to close and cannot. She says it with a story that a monk carried out of the wilderness and an old patriarch wrote down in a city under siege, and a tradition preserved through 15 centuries of change and catastrophe, and the slow accumulation of a world that looks almost nothing like the world she was born into. She says it with a body found in the sand, face turned east, hands folded, the desert quiet around her.